Hi, I'm Gerry Kearns. I'm from the NUIM. I'm a historical geographer. And Holly asked if I would animate or provoke or whatever. I don't really think I need to do very much provoking. There's been plenty of provoking today that you've probably been sitting on your reflections and are ready to share them with each other. Let me just try to perhaps structure a path through some of those reflections and see if anybody wants to join me on that. I'd like to comment about four things that came up during the day. One is, and they're all about the relationship between art and heritage, and the most important one is perhaps the second. But the four things I'd like to just mention. Firstly, some sense of the relationship between art and heritage within art practice. What place does heritage have within art practice? Secondly, some sense of what is the relationship between art and heritage in thinking about our care of places, our duty of care towards place. Thirdly, to think a little bit about what's the relationship between art and heritage in trying to understand or trying to do better about attending to questions of identity and becoming. This notion of attention, what's contained in that? So practice, care, attention. And the last one that I want to say something about is hospitality. What is the place of art and heritage in a society that might be built around notions of hospitality? Because it seems to me that care and attention might build towards hospitality, and I'd like to say something about some of those. And I'll stop after each brief reflection and ask if anybody wants to elaborate or respond to that, and then I'll move on to the next one. Holly has a microphone, so if you put your hands up, I'll keep talking until I see some hands, and then I'll pause and let people contribute. So if you don't hear me an awful lot, you'll put your hands up. And I'm sure that no more sinister threat will be needed. So, firstly, let me say a little bit about art practice. One of the speakers today drew a sort of distinction between heritage as in a sense a content, and art as in a sense of form, as if we might think of heritage as supplying some materials with which artists would work in order to convey that heritage better. I'm a little puzzled, or not puzzled, but I'd just like to trouble that distinction a little bit, because it seems to me that heritage is also very much a form. When people think about heritage, they think about a particular way of relating to our past, a way that's heavily influenced by notions of conservation. And one of the things that we've been hearing today, I think, is about trying to trouble that notion of heritage, trying to recognise that there is a much greater diversity of ways of engaging with the past than something which is highly driven by notions of conservation, preservation and transmission. That there might be more challenging, more critical ways of thinking about the past that aren't necessarily so attentive to the primary needs of conservation. And secondly, the other thing I think we've heard today is that art itself is not simply a way of doing things. It's not simply a way of doing what heritage wants to do. Art is itself a content. Art is itself one of the layers that we might want to attend to, preserve and cherish. So there's not a way of talking about something else. It's a way of actually being part of our society and being an addition to these things that people will want to cherish in the future. So this distinction between heritage supplying content and art delivering the message strikes me as perhaps a little overdrawn, and we might want to think about heritage as a very problematic form, as a problematic relationship to the past, and we might want to think about art as a set of problematic contents that we might want to cherish and conserve and treat as a heritage into the future. And to do that, there are at least 4 sorts of art practice or ways of doing art that I heard about today. And I don't want to come down on the sort of Lucy Lippard and various discussions about art for art's sake. But I mean, this notion of what art is to serve is part of that. The 4 things that I heard about the use of art in education, that in schools and so on, that art might be part of the way of getting young people to engage with things like stories, like history, like heritage. I heard about art as something which has lifts the human spirit, that centres people and is part of healthy living, that artistic practice might be something that people should be given many more opportunities to do, because it actually makes them healthier and more fulfilled and enriched people. I heard something about artistic forms as ways of collecting and conserving, ways of passing things on, particularly in Nick, that there might be forms in which we pass these stories on to a future generation. What I didn't hear as much about was the challenging things the challenging questions that artists set themselves in the quiet, sometimes, of their own imagination, the things that they find extremely difficult to do, the challenges that they put to themselves as artists. They might have to go via any of those first 3 in order to perhaps attract funding or to attract an audience, but there is something about the integrity of the artwork that I haven't heard as much today about how artists might find that engagement with heritage practice could be part of doing the most difficult forms of creation, the most challenging forms of self-expression. I heard a little bit less about that, so I'm overstating it, but I would want to hold on to a place for something that we might think of as art for art's sake within an engagement with heritage, and not simply art as a pragmatic service towards the heritage industry. I don't know if anybody's got any admonitions or...
I think that there is always a difficulty in carving out a space for that kind of aesthetic contemplation within often durational or unfolding research-based art projects. And it's certainly a dilemma I've faced a lot, and I'm trying to figure a way through now. But I suppose there's a kind of ethical question in the middle of it, which is around representation and representing other people's histories. It was kind of struck me today as I was presenting about the post office and the postmaster in particular. I'm thinking, actually, you know, I'm here talking about somebody who is tremendously inspiring, or, you know, whose memory is tremendously inspiring, but it's at the same time, it's his story. Now, so the whole question of, I suppose, framing, and how as artists we hold the tools of representation, and we can seduce, and we can teeter into appropriating other people's stories, and you know, I'm just throwing that out there as, I suppose, something that I've become increasingly aware of in my practice.
Well, you live in community, the village where you're living, where you're rearing your children, or where you're, especially from a rural background, people ask, what do you do? And And you know, you don't really know what you do. And like, I could have talked about the walking projects that we do, or the voluntary other stuff we do, like putting up nail bushes and stuff. You just, and even this kind of thing, even do you tell people you're an artist? Because I don't know, I'm just Mick, and that's what I do, stuff, you know, that kind of way in some ways. And so until you come to events like this, you start to get labelled and bracketed and you have on splash, what do we do, you know? It's an interesting one, I think, for us to have to kind of figure out what our jobs are and what really do we do, you know. I don't know if you're artists, qualified slash in some way.
But one of the things that kept me sane was sticking with the craft and the craft of painting, so that I would have that sense of going into a poetic space, still, you know, it's investigating and exploring, but actually being with the paints. And I think maybe that's what you're thinking about in what you were saying there, Gerry. And I also find that I will do workshops with people from the area who come into my studio, and they're just mad into painting. There's just something about the paint.
My question is the art that we're creating today, is it the heritage of the future? Is this what we're creating, is heritage? And in that regard, it's a natural marriage to the Heritage Council. We're doing interpretations of our surroundings, of where we live, where we come from, be it through dance, be it through song, be it through fine arts. We are creating the heritage of the future.
The second theme I wanted to raise is the relationship between art and heritage around a notion of attention. And I heard a lot today that struck me as ways that both heritage and art are trying to cultivate our capacity for attention. And for example, with the lace making, you know, that people would go to classes and share with someone, a skilled lace maker, a craft that produced something that was not only very beautiful, but was something that gave them a respect for the way that had been done by people in times past, but a respect for that was leading them into a fuller engagement with those past lives and with the difficulties of those past lives, that people who were making lace were possibly doing lots and lots of other things at the same, you know, during the day. I mean, they were raising children. This was not a contemplative leisure activity like a Jane Austen novel, people sitting in a circle while the vicar stared at his cup of tea. This was a craft of people who were in rather desperate straits, and some of these crafts would come into communities simply as ways of allowing people to make a little bit of extra money that would enable them to feed their families. I think this notion of attending to these stories and this past gives us two things. It gives us a perspective on our own communities and the things that have to come into those communities to help us to retain children. I mean, a lot of the stories today have come from rather small places, and many of these small places will be having difficulty retaining the next generation of children unless things come into these places, not necessarily industry and not necessarily only tourism, but we're attending to the way people get by. We're attending to making do, and that I think there's something quite special about learning to attend, learning to pause, because I think it creates a space for respect, a respect that is part of what heritage can do at its best, but it's also a respect that feeds back onto ourselves, and we value our own lives and our own challenges and our own difficulties. We not only put them into perspective that there have been many other people who have had these difficulties and have faced these challenges around us, and that they left residues in the landscape and in our accents and in our vocabulary and in our field names and in the gravestones in our church. They left residues that can be part of a sort of encouragement to ourselves that we're not the first people to face the sorts of existential threats that small town Ireland currently faces. So this notion of attention, I think, can be a fulcrum between past and present, which leads to greater respect, even for ourselves, and a more forgiving approach, even to ourselves.
Without going on again about lace making per se, but just what you've just brought up, it resonated during the year, particularly with the Me Too movement, and just women's place in history and the social history that goes with lace making in Headford. You know, and there was a difficulty that we were going to romanticise this story just because we had hit on a really interesting story. But while we were doing our walking tours of Headford and going past the lace makers' cottages, we have somebody in our community who lives there and has lived there for some time. And she was explaining to us that, you know, talking about lace making was going to bring up possible notions of shame as well for a lot of people, because if you had lace making in your family, it was probably because you were very poor. And if you lived on New Street, it was probably because you were very poor. And another name for New Street was actually Garina Mucke, which is actually the pig's field. So the poorest of the poor lived on this street, and the houses they lived in were tiny, would have a full family living in there, and possibly 2 or 3 lodgers as well. And they would have had a garden out the back that they were living from that would have provided them with their food. And if they had a lace maker in the house, it would have done several things for them. One, it would have been an extra income, but because the lace would have had to be kept clean, it would have also meant that the standards of cleanliness in the cottage would have come up, and therefore maybe those children had a better chance of surviving. So it's exactly as you're saying, it brings a huge attention to the lives that have gone before us and the strength of those women and the fact that they endured through real, real hardship, you know. So it was just the respect that we had for the story afterwards then, you know, it grew from there kind of thing. So.
My name is Beth Murphy and I'm local here to Kildare, and I just want to give a mention to the basket makers of Ireland, because I live on a 2-acre plot outside Kildare town and I grow my own willow there, and I have basically from my own back kept alive, I suppose, the tradition of basket weaving in Kildare. So I've been working with all the old techniques, and just last weekend I run workshops at my cottage there, as well as working in schools with children as well, and passing on the heritage and bringing it into art forms as well. So I think I work with the whole thing, you know, old world craft, bringing it into new world without any college degree or without any support. I suppose that's the big thing with support when you're working on something like that there's nobody in colleges that can teach you. You really have to go and get self-taught, but you're always questioning yourself. And then you're also questioning yourself because you fill out applications and hoping that you'll get a bit of support from the powers that be, and 9 out of 10 times the door will be closed. But you keep going because you love it and it's in your blood. That's where it is. It's a love, it's a passion, and attention to detail is that you will learn that skill to the best of your knowledge. So when people come into my workshop and from various parts of Ireland, various parts of the world, you can share the ancient stories that aren't recorded a lot with basket making, just as much as lace making as well. But it's great to be able to share those stories, that this is the basket that the people ate from when they didn't have a table. This is the basket that people ate from when they had no chairs. You know, this is the first base that was made in Ireland, the great base. But that's you teaching that knowledge. But like, just to finish up with this, that just before Christmas I made a traditional log basket, which there is a lot to it, and it was so big. And it's physically demanding, and you're growing the materials yourself as well. And the customer came and he said, I said, now that could be my last log basket, I said to him. And he said, oh God, you can't give up that skill. You know, you have that skill now. And I said, well, I'm not getting 10 euros an hour. You know, so I think we need to really, you know, think about that when people are looking for funding and etc., and coming from there without any support. They're the people we need to actually look after, the people that are keeping the skills alive.
So we might be able to find a way of attending to our past, which cultivates passions for us in the things around us, in a slightly agnostic way, where we actually take a double take. because we can be fiercely proud to have the type of heritage that we have, to have the type of traditions that we have, without thinking that there's anything intrinsically better. In that people in other places can be fiercely proud of something very different to our own. And I think we need to take care of all the capacities that there are in our society for transmitting into the future a diversity of possibilities of values and ways of living. So I would be sort of keen on a kind of ironic heritage, where we preserve, we conserve, we preserve, we celebrate, we pass on, simply because it's here and it's ours, and it gives us resources with which to be critical, with which to be diverse, so that the danger is the danger of any singular narrative. The danger is you have a sort of passion for the past which is captured by a particular story about who we are. That, I think, is very unhelpful for us. It's very unhealthy. What we need is such a rich sense of our heritage that you can always be anybody with it. You can be an Irish citizen of the world. You know, you can be you can celebrate any sexuality through an Irish dimension. You can celebrate any particular physical configuration in an Irish way, so that we become fiercely proud of being the particular type of Irish person that we are, because we live with other Irish neighbours. And that includes blow-ins like me. I mean, you know, my parents are from North Dublin, but as soon as I open my mouth, it's clear I'm not. My partner has got red hair. She is immediately taken for Irish everywhere we go, and I'm immediately not. But we're both here in our various ways, and there was a British politician who died a few years ago called Bernie Grant. And Bernie Grant was Afro-Caribbean, and he was challenged on television once. Somebody said to him, "Well, how can you be English?" You know, there was a racist tone to the question, of course. And Bernie Grant said, "I have been here and I have contributed." And in Ireland, Thomas Davies said that people in Ireland who were English had time and some citizenship on their side. Time and some citizenship. As if the two went together. As if you accrued citizenship through the contribution you made to the community, through being there. So in the present, there's a diversity, but it's a diversity that can be fed by a particular relationship to the past, as long as our relationship to the past has such a Catholic with a small c passion for a range of things, that it provides resources for any particular way you want to live in the present, without foreclosing them at all, but always telling us that there are other ways of living in the present than we currently do. So this is what I mean for a care for place. A care for place is a care for the richness of those places, because that richness sustains a diversity which, in any particular way of living, we're never fully living up to. So in caring for place, in caring for the diversity of those stories, we're also creating the possibility of caring for our diverse, multi-faith and multicultural selves.
Something that a lot of artists do is trouble that by looking at their post-colonial past and its impact today. And I think that's a very recent history for Ireland, and something that it's still processing.
Grace Diaz, I liked her piece in the Irish Times where she was talking about, I just saw her play about the laundry, and the play is animated by this anger that this laundry is going to be given to a Japanese hotel company, and it's on the very last one. But also she said we need to sit with this history a little longer. You know, we can't go beyond it. We're not ready to go beyond it.
Counterpoint to that is that if we keep picking over that scab, that we are doomed to keep to keep replaying that narrative? Is there? I've been thinking a lot about forgetting lately, actually. And we're so busy monumentalising our history. What about the notion of perhaps letting some of it go, not being so high-bound to the notion to revisiting those old sores?
I do agree with you that we do need to shed some skin in order to move forward, and this is what we were talking about with bringing our heritage into a living space, a contemporary space with us, like using our hands to create that kind of space of reflection and attendance that you were talking about earlier, Gerry, where we are actually, because of our human scale and are still the same bodies that we've been for millennia, and we still have the same hands, we create a timeless space where we can connect to our past.
This notion that we've been hearing a lot about recovering stories, passing on stories, respect for different sorts of lives within a society that's incredibly inegalitarian, although it has an egalitarian. Ireland's got a very, in my mind, my experience of Ireland's got a very strong egalitarian ethos, but a very weak egalitarian practice. People's, that's where a lot of sort of begrudgery comes from. It's a sort of egalitarian ethos, but I don't see much egalitarian practice. What I see is the commodification of everything, the privatisation of everything, and so on. So I think we live in a society where if somebody can make money privately from something, nobody else has got a right to interfere with them doing that, even if it's not for the public benefit. So we will actually damage rural post offices because they might compete with ATMs. Because ATMs will deliver shareholders' profits. They will, that's part of the real economy. That's part of the productive economy. That's not part of the economy that's subsidised. And then we've got a very weakly developed notion of the public. Public servants in this country are ashamed of themselves because they're always being told to be ashamed of themselves. Anybody who works in the public sector is monitored to within an inch of their life in some ways, and it's not because this will improve service. It's because people won't trust them. So we're going to give you taxes, but we're going to make sure that your life as somebody who works on the back of taxes is so miserable that nobody in their right mind would do it, rather than do something in the really creative private sector. And I think we need to make a very strong plea for the importance of creativity within the public sector. That in fact, the kind of public values around which a lot of creativity can thrive, can actually only thrive in the public sector. Without a public sector, we'd have much less creativity. So the notion that creativity is something to do with the market, an initiative, is I think that's something that an awfully large part of Irish politics has bought. I think it's quite damaging. And this brings me to the notion of hospitality. Because what is hospitality? Hospitality is making room for other people. It's welcoming them into a space that we could have closed the door on. And it seems to me that Ireland as a society has gone from 1% foreign born about 20 years ago to 10% foreign born today. England went from 1% foreign born to 10% between 1850 and 1980. 130 years. Ireland has gone through a massive change, very fast change. And I think this notion of hospitality will be under strain because of that. And yet I think heritage, if it's approached properly, if it's approached as something that relates to cherishing a diversity of possible ways of living from the past, artists in attending to that diversity, artists in attending to the submerged lives, in attending to the lives lived in darkness, can create a space for an expanded notion of hospitality. And an artwork like Grace Dyer's recent piece about the laundry, we don't know what's buried here. I mean, immediately after, there was a discussion afterwards, and immediately people were talking about direct provision. Immediately. They went straight from Sean McDermott Street and digging up bones of a baby, of a baby that may have been there, or that was the conceit of the story, that this woman kept coming back to try and dig up the park in Shawmerdurma Street, thinking that she might find the bones of the baby that was taken from her. But people's immediate reflection was, isn't this what direct provision is about? And that is the capacity of art. One of the capacities of art is to expand our notion of hospitality to I can't remember the phrase that was used earlier on from Seamus Heaney, but to prick our consciences in a way that will enable us to understand that from difficult and diverse pasts, we can develop the capacity for living generously with each other in difficult and diverse presents. So I don't know if you've got any final thoughts on that. We're more or less at time now. But
Just in terms of hospitality, I'd just like to bring us back present into the building that we're sitting in, and to see that as another aspect of Bridget, who has inspired this place. Her spirit of generosity, her care for those in need, and also as a patron of the poet, the blacksmith, the healer. And we're all here really trying to work with those strands. So I'm just grateful we're here and we're talking.
But you spoke, maybe it was your first point, about maybe why artists do it. It almost sounded like a description for wellness. It's hardly that. I think most people who work as artists do it because it allows us room to think deeply about things, to pay attention, to challenge received notions about culture, about who you are as an Irish, you put it, who you are as an Irish person. And in the context of funding, I think that we all mention that really because that's purely mentioned in the context of the challenge of realizing the work. I don't think that today's conversation is the place to talk about really why we're doing what we're doing. That's a different seminar. And then finally on the notion of hospitality, the irony should be lost on none of us. When you mentioned, the conversation after Grace Dias' play, going on to direct provision, that the asylum seekers are staying in hotels that belong to, handed the contracts from the friends of politicians. Thanks.
I hear lots of conversations around the mainstream, whoever the mainstream are, either kind of mainstream public or mainstream art world or something, but actually in fact there's otherness kind of weaving through all of us and in everything that we do. And I think it's really great that art practice can bring a consciousness to that we have the other is always, whether you speak in kind of folkloric terms or you speak in very political terms, that space for the other is actually in fact a lot of what all of us are doing. And I always like to describe both heritage and art as being a third space where we can step out of the daily grind or whatever it is and have that space when we talk about contemplation or reflection or deep thinking or maybe it's provocation or maybe it's silliness or laughter, but to have that third space where we can step back and reflect on all of these conversations. Thank you very much today.